Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Merci et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. My name is Kathy Fisher and I'm the Vice Chair of the Ottawa Public Library Board. And welcome to our discussion today with renowned Canadian epidemiologist David Waltner-Toews. David's recently released book on pandemics, deadly diseases from bubonic plague to coronavirus, discusses the impact of animal-borne diseases on our world and encourages us to re-examine our role in pandemics for our own health and for the health of our planet. Quill and Quire magazine called it a quiet little gem of understanding in a cacophony of panic and fear. I would like to thank our partners, Ottawa International Writers Fest, thank you, and Library and Archives Canada, merci. Their collaboration makes it possible to host author events that bring us together, like this afternoon, now virtually, for timely, engaging discussions like this. I also invite you to visit the Ottawa Public Library website to see what other virtual programs we have available this month, including our third Spring Book Social with Dewey Divas, and a special musical concert for National Indigenous History Month with the musical duo Twin Flames. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sean Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words. Thank you and have a great afternoon. Merci et bonne fin de journée à tous et à toutes.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here on behalf of the Writers Festival with you virtually. I want to thank also the Public Library, the Ottawa Public Library, and Library and Archives Canada for their support. We're looking forward to an amazing fall season. We're going to be doing weekly events starting in end of August, and there's amazing things coming, and we're really missing being with you all in person, but we're so grateful to get together, at least virtually. I do want to remind everybody that this amazing book on pandemics is available from independent booksellers all over the country. Perfect Books has copies you can order online. You can socially distance while supporting local booksellers and small presses. I mean, this is one of the remarkable times when the win-win-win is not only will you get a great book, you'll also be supporting a great local business, a great Canadian publisher, a brilliant author, and please do take a moment to buy books. And if you can't buy the book, go to the library and read the book, because that's fundamentally what we're here to do, is encourage you to connect with big ideas. We're so grateful to have as our host a Canadian Screen Award-winning journalist. And I've been waiting to say that for so long. I'm so proud of our CBC Ottawa team for winning that award. Lucy and Adrian do an amazing job connecting our community. I've been saying that for many, many years, and it's nice that the Academy is finally recognizing the good work they're doing. I'm thrilled for them. So without further ado, all I'm going to say is thank you so much for joining us, and let's give a warm virtual round of applause to our host, Canadian Screen Award winner, Lucy van Oldenbarneveld.
Oh, Sean, you nut. Thank you so much for that. That is a great introduction. Thank you. And I have to say, I'm just getting my bearings on this whole thing. This is my first Screen virtual interview, and I'm thrilled that David is here to talk to us. So just by way of introduction, you know, as we've all come to know in 2020, epidemiologists are the rock stars of 2020. The 1980s U2, the late 90s Michael Jordan, the Beyonce of the new decade. So we're very lucky to have David Waltner-Toews just here with us now to cheer us up with discussion on plagues, pandemics, viruses, and disease. Actually, you know, as Kathy and Sean mentioned, David has written a book that is full of wisdom, history, and science, and that is also a very compelling read, a real page-turner. He's such a great storyteller. This book was first published in 2007, but quickly updated to include what we are now facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. David Waltner-Toews is an epidemiologist, a veterinarian, a specialist in epidemiology of food and waterborne diseases, zoonoses, I hope I'm saying that right. Yeah, he's an expert in that, so how disease is transmitted from animals to humans. He's lived and worked all around the world, and today we've reached him at his home in Kitchener to talk about on pandemics. David, hello.
Hello. Such a cheap
Nice.
topic. Yes.
But it's such an important one. And for all of the people that are listening right now, I just want to say we're going to get to your Q&A in about 40 minutes. So please find the Q&A button and start sending your questions in now, because we'll have plenty of time to get them all asked to David, hopefully as many as we can. So David, you know, where to start in this? Why don't we start right where we are now with COVID-19? What do the next 12 months look like for us?
Okay. Yeah. You know, I'm a veterinary epidemiologist, the human epidemiologist, if you want. Start when somebody comes to the hospital door and they get sick and then they start transmitting it. I usually start before that. So looking ahead, if I'm just looking at this virus, it's a very, I was going to say a perfect virus for this time. It's managed to evolve in such a way that it doesn't have one clinical manifestation, right? So when we had SARS, you had respiratory disease, people were coughing, you could isolate them, you know who's got it. With this one, you have two people who are infected, one person dies, the other person walks away, doesn't even know they're infected. So this virus is unusual that way, but it turns out that from an evolutionary perspective, if you take the long view, it's a great way for a virus to survive, because it's hard to pin it down, say, this is what it looks like in people, so this is what we can do. It makes it harder to isolate, which means we're going to have to live with this, whether or not we get a vaccine, which I'm not sure we will. We probably will, but who knows how long it will last. You get a vaccine, does it last 2 months, 3 months? Does the virus mutate? Because these viruses are unstable, right? So we're entering a phase where there's going to be a new normal, if you want. We're going to have to reinvent our society, the way we do things, everything. So that's the clearest answer. Well, at least until my grandchildren are around, I guess, you know, our lifetimes. I think because it was such an unexpected pandemic. I mean, we predicted it, right? I say we collectively, epidemiologists, people were saying this, but it was a little bit like saying, well, there's going to be an earthquake on the West Coast, or there's going to be a volcano in the Philippines. Yeah, but to say that now this is going to happen, I think it caught people off guard simply because it's not, you know, people have been watching Contagion and there aren't people dying in the streets everywhere. So
let me just pick up on that, David. When you talk about it being predictable, and you talk about this in your book, you said, we have known for many years what needs to be done to prevent pandemics. Yeah. So why haven't we acted is the question you ask. How would you answer that?
Well, there were a lot of other things going on, right? I mean, we get distracted. There are all the political things going on, economic, and because the situation we've been in has benefited a lot of people. So we went to economies of scale, brought the price of food down, lots of food production, people have jobs, employment rates going up, everything seems to be fine. And so to say, well, something is, you know, a pandemic's going to come and it's going to be serious. We don't know how serious. We don't know exactly when it's going to come. It's pretty hard for someone in government to say, well, let's set aside a bunch of money in order to address something that might or might not happen within my tenure as prime minister or president, and it might or might not be serious. So I don't fault people for getting caught off guard.
Just, can you describe that a little bit more for us? You call it a perfect storm of animal disease, and you touched on it there when you referenced economies of scale. But you make the case in your book that there are so many elements going into how we got to where we are today. Just broaden that for us a little bit, if you would.
Okay. I'll go back a little bit further than I did in the book. There's a disease called African swine fever, which was originally came out of Africa, and it was the Europeans brought it, another disease there, and it got transmitted into Europe. 2018, this disease got into China, beginning of 2018. And it came either from Russia or from Europe or from Africa. Nobody's quite sure. And of course, everybody denies it. But what happened in 2018, 2019 was that half the pigs in China died or were killed to try to prevent the spread of this disease. It's a serious disease of pigs. Doesn't affect people. So 200 million pigs dead. At the same time, there were outbreaks of bird flu. So half the chickens in some of these farms died. Again, it's not a disease that's been spread around as a pandemic among people. And then you're coming up to Chinese New Year. So you got tens of millions of people. They're looking for food. They're going to have a big dinner. They're traveling around. They come to the markets. There aren't any pigs. The chickens, there aren't that many chickens. So what do? So the people in the markets are selling what they've got, right? So they're selling wildlife. They're selling other kinds of meats, which is the same thing any entrepreneur would do anywhere in the world. You could argue that it wasn't that well regulated, but you know, that's in retrospect. And so you have all of these things happening at once, and then all you needed was all these people coming together. You've got different species. You've got the viruses, which have probably been circulating for a while in that area, because they weren't selling bats there. They weren't even selling the animals that they think were the ones that had it before it got to people. There weren't pangolins there. So we're looking at different species. So it's probably been circulating. And then we've got this storm of all of these things happening. And then you have a virus which transmits easily, doesn't have a clear presentation. And so people are caught off guard.
Mm. You mentioned pangolins there. I'll just in case people don't know, the sort of the scaly anteater that's one of the most highly trafficked animals in the world illegally, right? And there's some thought that maybe the virus came to us from them. But David, what would you say about wet markets? I mean, there was a lot of conversation about wet markets in Wuhan early on in this pandemic.
Right.
Where does that all fit into this discussion and the origin of this?
I mean, a wet market is one term for a fresh farmer's market, if you want. I mean, the ones in Southeast Asia are more crowded and busier than the ones we have here, but they have fresh meat and fresh vegetables. Everybody wants to have fresh. That's the other thing that's happened, is that the people who market food say you want to have it fresh. We sell the freshest food in town. Well, that means something different in each culture. And in Chinese culture, it means it's alive when you buy it, right? And then they either kill it in front of you at a restaurant, which I've seen, or you take it home, you kill it yourself. And so you've got live animals, and they're more likely to transmit the disease there. But we have, I mean, you look at what happened here with the slaughterhouses. You have outbreaks in slaughterhouses. You've got people working in close quarters. You've got meat there. Maybe you don't have vegetables, but you've got this transference of viruses and bacteria in close quarters. So that would be the wet market. I think what's different maybe in China is they've got more than 1 billion people, right? If we had the same thing, we had the same kinds of markets here, we wouldn't have maybe the same problems. Because we don't have that many people crowded together in one place.
But when we are trying to figure out where the virus started and how it
Yep.
made the jump to humans,
Yes.
what is that series of events? I mean, did it start with a bat? Was it the pangolin? Just take us through that and what we know.
It probably started with a bat. We know there are some serious viruses that bats carry around, and we've known this since late 80s, early 90s. There was a disease in Malaysia called Nipah virus, which was the basis of the movie Contagion, when, you know, dead people in the streets and so on. It was a really serious disease. It came from bats who were feeding on mango trees around pig farms, and then they were pooping in the pig farms. The pigs got sick, the people got sick, and like 40–50% of the people died. That was contained. But at that point, researchers, and many of my colleagues who are doing wildlife epidemiology, started looking at bats and saying, well, they've got all these other viruses. We know probably Ebola in Africa, and maybe some of these other viruses are a problem. So how it got from the bats into other species, like maybe a pangolin, is, we don't know, because the trafficking of wildlife, nobody's really tracking that. Where the bats are hanging out, they fly around. They fly around, right? And they hang from the trees. Flying foxes, they migrate around Southeast Asia. So they could be carrying at various places. They could be in fruit orchards where there are animals foraging around on the ground. And so those other animals pick it up. Somebody gets those animals, they take it to market, and we eat those. And then in the market, that's where the people get exposed.
Okay. Okay. You know, I mean, one of the things that you paint so clearly here is the perfect storm of animal disease, as you say, economies of scale and global trade and the role that that is playing in pandemics. There's an example you use about chicken. You talk about the exponential growth in the number of chickens that we are raising and eating, like exponential growth. Why is that such a dangerous thing for humans? What does that mean and what does that represent?
Okay, I'll give you the positive side first. The reason we went there is you have economies of scale. You have more chickens in one place, your capital costs are lower, the price at the grocery store is lower, and so more people can afford to buy chicken. Right? So this has been a long-standing dream. You know, a chicken in every pot goes back to 1400 to Henry IV of France.
And Tommy Douglas.
All of those, right.
Yes.
And so here is a way that this was delivered. So we went down that road. It was seen primarily as an economic way to bring food to the masses, if you want. Everybody could go and eat chicken. Good source of low-fat protein. What it misses, however, is that those chickens have their own microbiomes, is what we talk about now. They weren't talking about those, you know, even 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that there are all these microbes, viruses, fungi living in and around chickens. You crowd them together. The more you crowd them, the more likely they are to shed, whether it's salmonella or whether it's some other virus, you know, avian influenza. You take them into if you can control it at the farm, which they have by what they call biosecurity. You wear a hazmat suit to go into a chicken barn nowadays. It goes to the slaughterhouse, and there it can be transferred between the chickens and from the chickens to the people that are working there, because you've got such a huge volume of animals coming through. And so it's the other way to solve that problem of a chicken in every pot. One way is to say, let's put it all on the production end and say the farmers, if they have big farms, produce a lot, brings the price down. Great. If we have smaller farms, smaller slaughterhouses, we don't have to go back to, you know, subsistence living. I'm talking about something in between, you know, family-sized farms, if you want. It increases the cost. And anybody that tries to get organic or local realizes that the price goes up. Well, then poor people can't afford to buy it. So what do? One of the ways is to go back to economies of scale. The other way is to say is, well, that's an economic problem. Maybe something like guaranteed income or some sort of another way to have people have a sufficient income in order to pay for their food is a way to address it as an economic issue rather than simply as a biological farmer's issue. And then it takes the pressure off the farming systems and distributes it. But it's really hard. One of the things that led to the current situation is that we have what are called social determinants of disease, economic inequities, poverty, and huge reports on that. We know it's important. And then we have the environmental and the medical determinants of disease. And those have been kept separate rather than saying these things are really closely linked. And rather than simply saying we're going to solve all of our food problems by decreasing the price of food, we can solve some of the problems by bringing it down, but maybe we're going to have to look at the social context and change some of the, you know, minimum wage, guaranteed income, anything. There are various options for that.
And I think if I have the term correctly, you call this peripheral vision in your book, when we look at things sort of in a more interconnected way. And that's what you're touching on there. I mean, if you could expand a bit more on that, but also, what do you think the length of this pandemic is teaching us about what we need to do to get along better or to prevent this thing in the future? If you could touch on that.
It's giving us a wonderful opportunity. I hate to say that this pandemic is a wonderful opportunity, but it is. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the peripheral vision, I first picked up on that from Oliver Sacks, who was talking about his own peripheral vision, and he found that when he lost it, he was stumbling. right? And then I thought, as scientists, as a society, the same way we focus on something that's in front of us. I'm a really good expert, I know how to do this, and somebody else knows how to do that, somebody else knows how to do that. So if I'm working here, let's say in economic development, I get blindsided by something that comes out of ecology, wildlife, because I'm not watching that. Well, I can't look at everything. So then the question is, how can we create spaces, organizations, institutions that allow better communication across all those it used to be called silos, but these kind of barriers between different things to look at. And so we become each other's peripheral vision, so that if somebody is in the market and they see something, or if somebody's doing social studies, or if somebody is working in agriculture and they see something emerging and they say, well, maybe we should talk to somebody in this other field, and you start sharing that information. And what's happened in this particular pandemic is that the last one, SARS, well, that wasn't the last pandemic. We had H1N1, which was also an interesting example. But for SARS, you knew what it was in front of you. People got sick, and it was wham bang, and we could just focus on identify the virus, contain it, contain the people who have it, maybe get a vaccine, but it happened so fast we didn't get a vaccine. So we could bounce back very quickly. So the technical part of the science has acted very fast, and we're really good at that, but we didn't have to address any of the underlying social and economic and ecological issues. This one is lasting long enough that we're going, maybe we have an opportunity here, a wonderful opportunity to rethink and reinvent our institutions in such a way that we can respond more quickly and better next time.
And how hopeful are you that that will happen?
I see those kinds of changes happening already. I mean, despite all of the chaos and everything around us, even the protests in the US bring out very strongly the social issues, the economic issues, the inequities. We all knew about them for a long time, but this brings it out, and it makes it, yeah, those things are important for health as well. Can we create food production systems that are, it's not that we're not going to trade, but maybe they're more local. We have more local food, we have more local production, and we're doing that already. We can't rely on international supply chains. That doesn't mean we're not going to have them. It means we're going to be a little bit more careful. And I think that's a good thing.
Is it turning everyone into a socialist now? I mean, look at Doug Ford. He's,
I don't like those terms very well.
Okay.
The socialist, capitalist kind of dichotomy, because it's most of the successful responses have been some sort of a mix. You know, you've got, you look at Finland, or you look at Norway, or you look at New Zealand or Vietnam. You've got different kinds of governments, and you've got local entrepreneurs doing things, and you've got government programs that provide a kind of safety net and a regulatory framework. Is that socialism? I think the socialism capitalism battle is a 20th century, 19th, 20th century battle. And I think the young people, I remember teaching foodborne diseases this was in the early part of this century, and having students come in, and I was talking about the change in foodborne disease in the former Soviet Union when the wall came down. And I got all kinds of blank looks, and one of the older students came to me afterwards, and he said, you know, nobody in this class knew what you meant when you said that the Berlin Wall came down. They didn't catch the reference that this changed the whole dynamic of what was going on. And, you know, there were outbreaks of botulism in Ukraine and places like that because people had to rely on themselves. They didn't know how to can food anymore.
Well, I mean, whether we call it socialism or capitalism, I guess I totally take your point, but I guess it makes us more aware of who is falling through the cracks. We just have to look to the long-term care homes. And even Hugh Siegel, who was on the Ottawa Public Library discussion last week, said, you know, in order to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you have to have boots. So I think there seems to be more awareness of how we need to go back to community.
That's an important piece. The other one, which is often missing, is the wildlife piece, and it comes back to the bats. And we see this most clearly in Ebola virus in Africa, where we had civil wars in Liberia and Guinea-Bissau and that part of French West Africa. And when those wars stopped, there was all kinds of investment, mines coming in, deforestation, loggers, and people were displaced. And there have been huge outbreaks of Ebola since then. Well, what happened? Well, people were displaced. They were working in mines and various companies. They were looking for new sources of food, what's more readily available, where there were, called bushmeat. Some of those animals were already sick from Ebola virus. Easiest to catch, right? So you catch those, you eat them, and then you start an epidemic there. So you could say, well, that's over in Africa. And you go, yes, it's true, but why are they mining there? Well, they're mining to get minerals to produce computers and Zoom and all of these, so we can do these kinds of things. So what can we do to, in fact, ensure that the people who are working, it's the global equivalent of ensuring that local farm workers are adequately taken care of, where you take care of the people who are working in mines and forestry in Democratic Republic of Congo or in French West Africa. They're well taken care of. They have health programs. They have adequate income, because it's in our global interest that happens, so that Ebola virus doesn't get on, mutate and get on a plane and come over here.
And just a note to everyone who's tuned in, you can send in questions. We'll be getting to questions, the Q&A section for David very soon. Just on your screen, you'll see a Q&A or a chat. If that's on your screen, please send in your questions now. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. David, back to the COVID-19 itself. You talked about H1N1 in your book, SARS, H5N1. Why is COVID hitting us so much harder than other viruses that have spread?
Well, again, it's a combination of things. One is we had an impression that after SARS came along, we've kind of fixed the system. We knew how to do that now. So if SARS comes along again, we're ready for it, right? So that was part of it. And the momentum of these other global trading for food. I mean, the H1N1 in 2009, 2010 didn't seem serious at the time, but there were a couple 100,000 people that died in retrospect. It was below the radar. But that was a large American company in Mexico selling pigs to China, in fact, large volumes of pigs to China. So that big trading system, people say, well, we're so dependent on China. In fact, the people that often complain now are the people that were saying, we want to trade in China. We were sending trade missions to China, with the Prime Minister and other people in tow, trying to market ourselves. So it's a bit rich to turn it around now and say, we shouldn't be trading with China. Well, there were reasons for it. You could argue that economically, some of those people are better off. And so we thought we had taken care of it. We'd taken care of the technical capabilities in such a way that, yes, we could identify this virus, we could get the genome, but we didn't address the larger social context and what this virus, by having different faces, if you want, by having neurological symptoms or blood symptoms or respiratory symptoms or no symptoms at all, it's unmasked this underlying, the social inequities and those kinds of things.
You talk about, in the book, you muse that maybe our fears are larger than the threat itself when it comes to pandemics. So what would you say about how much?
Say that?
You did. I don't have the page number, but
Okay,
I can get that for you.
No, it's okay.
Are fears right now larger than the threat when it comes to pandemics?
You froze on me.
Oh, okay. Can you see me now? Okay. Hope you're all good. Oh, there he is. He's back again.
Yeah.
David, okay, we'll go to this for now until we get it back.
Right.
We were talking about fear, and
yes.
our fear is now that we're going to lose you video-wise, so we've gone to audio.
Right.
What should our fears be when it comes to the pandemic? Are they larger than the threat itself?
They're different than the threat itself, I guess. And part of it is that my experience is that some of the best things happen when an old system is collapsing and a new one is emerging. I was working in Nepal at a time in the early 90s. After the Berlin Wall came down, there were democracy movements all over the world. And the same was true in Nepal. And what happened there was that the crash of the old system, there were demonstrations in the streets, there was a civil war with the Maoists, there were streets being blocked off. People reinvented a kind of local democracy that grew out of that, and it's been stable since then. And I think this is an opportunity. It's, you know, in the resilience framework, they talk about creative destruction. Well, it's only creative if we take advantage of it. It could just be destruction. And I'm hopeful because I see a lot of people who are younger than myself, which includes a very large group of people, taking action and moving ahead and reorganizing and support groups and all different ways of reorganizing themselves. So I'm optimistic that this will in fact be a creative response to the destruction that we're facing. The fear relates to losing all of our normal points of reference. And that's especially true for those of us that have benefited from this, right? I think people who've been on the bottom end of the scale, who didn't have steady jobs, who don't have a pension like me, you know, they're maybe not as afraid, which is one of the reasons they're out in the street, because it's not like they're losing a lot, but they have a lot to gain. Many of us in Canada, we've lived, I know this from having traveled around the world, we've lived in a bubble for decades. And it looks like, you know, the bubble is bursting. The question is, can we find a way to be in solidarity with people within our own society and around the world in such a way that nobody's dominating other people? We're sharing information, we're sharing ideas about how to reorganize. So it's a different kind of globalization, if you want.
Yeah, it really is teaching us so much. Thanks for making that point. That is, it's such an important one, and hopefully we will all take that lesson when we eventually get through to the other side of this. We have a lot of great questions coming in. I'm going to get to them in 1 second. I have a couple of random ones for you, David, because all of these chapters go back to animals in some way. You also talk about human hubris and Western hubris when it comes to how pandemics and illnesses change. Should we all become vegans?
The short answer is no, not all become vegans. The reason I say that is if I see feedlots around Chicago or southern Alberta, I think this is a travesty. This shouldn't be happening. It's bad for welfare. It's bad for the environment. If I go to a place like Rwanda or other countries in East Africa, the local farms with their small groups of cattle they provide manure, they provide fertilizer. If they don't have that, then they need to buy fossil fuel-based fertilizers. To me, that's not really a good response. And those animals provide a local source of protein, food, and that's what I mean. We don't have to go to these huge economies of scale, but we don't need to go to the sort of small subsistence farms. And the way they've dealt with it, for instance, in Vétérinaires Sans Frontières, some of the things we found is they set up cooperatives. So you have the benefits of the small farm, but you've also got the benefits of a larger group for marketing and selling and those kinds of things. The other part of, the Vets Without Borders, we also had projects on raising insects for consumption. And one of the things I noticed in looking at insects as food is that one of the responses is, well, if we take various kinds of insects, we grind them up, we get good sources of protein, and we feed them to animals, you're just plugging into this industrialized system and making it more efficient, if you want. That's helpful around the margins, but it really doesn't solve the underlying problem. I mean, in the 70s, it was soybeans were going to save the world, and now it was insects. And it's partly that, what we're eating, but it's partly also the way we've structured that food system. The other thing that happens if, you know, I'm happy if people are vegans. I don't eat that much meat. I eat some meat products, but it's a lot of vegan food is in fact industrialized food. You know, it's produced on a scale. It's highly processed. And if I look at it from the health point of view, I go, you know, if it's fresh vegetables, fresh produce, That's great. That's great if you live in Southern California. If you live in Southern Ontario, what do you do over the winter? And my ancestors came from the Ukraine. Mennonites settled in the prairies. What did they do all over winter? Well, the cattle were a way of overwintering certain kinds of food, right? You would put it in storage. The cattle could eat grasses and hays that we couldn't eat. And then you would have milk, or you would have eggs from the chickens. So there are better ways of integrating animals into agriculture that don't require everybody to go one way or everybody to go the other way. And I think we have this idea there's a global solution, that fits everybody. And that's not how it works, really.
Who was it in the States? Was it Michael Pollan who said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants?
That's
so I guess that
for me, that's the perfect motto.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. David, there's some awesome questions coming in. Let me give you, let's get started on these. Alan Eisenman said, his question is, the 1918-19 flu pandemic, which seems to have been far more severe, far more contagious, and killed many, many more people than the current pandemic, 20 to 50 million by various estimates, was very quickly forgotten once it subsided after three waves. What do you make of that?
Well, the part of what happened is that people were coming home from war, so they were already devastated. They were trying to reinvent what we were doing. There were food shortages, and in fact, the dilemmas we're in now are partly a response to that. And then got into the Great Depression and the droughts, and so people had other things to focus on. They were trying to renew and move ahead. There were certain things that were effective at stopping some of the old curses, if you want, vaccines for smallpox, sewage treatment to control cholera. And then as we went on, and then of course there was the Second World War, and that people forgot a lot during that time. And then we had epidemics of influenza in the 50s and 60s and on to the 90s. On the one hand, people are very resilient and we bounce back and we move on. That's good. The downside is that we forget the long-term history because we're trying so hard to reinvent and move ahead. And we find something that works and we say, we're going to run with this. And then the institutions change, the environment changes, but the institutions don't change quickly enough to come back to that.
Okay, and along those notes, Ariane or Dorothy has this question here. In the mid-2000s, when the bird flu threatened, the WHO mandated that member countries develop multidisciplinary pandemic plans. Why did these fail for COVID?
The avian influenza never became a human pandemic. It stayed in the chicken farms. The people that got infected were people that had direct contact. They were killing chickens, they were cooking them in the kitchen. So there were never that many human cases because it was all direct contact, and it never adapted to human spread. And it was much easier to get a group of I did a lot of work on that in Southeast Asia on avian influenza, and it was much easier to get a group of people together to work with farmers, because farmers have a very practical sense. Well, okay, we're gonna, in order to control this, maybe we need to kill these chickens, or maybe we're not gonna do that with human populations once it gets into the human populations. So you can change the way you manage farms, you can change vaccination programs, feeding programs. You can't manipulate human populations like that. And so the success story of avian influenza is that it never became a human pandemic. So it is a success story from that point of view. And I remember working on all these teams with economists, sociologists, all kinds of different groups of people on the ground. We had village health days in Laos with Veterinarians Without Borders. So we had medics and animal extension people and the local farmers and everybody talking and sharing information. It's much harder to do that if you're talking about human disease because it impinges on other power structures. And I remember talking to a group we had a meeting in Brazil, and there were people there from all over Latin America, and we were talking about these community-based approaches, multidisciplinary, and the people from Colombia said we couldn't do that. We said, why? And they said, well, because it would threaten the people who are now in power, and they would just put us out of business. So farmers, one thing, if you're working with the human populations, then the politicians step in and say, that's our work, right? You're not going to do this.
Okay. We have a question from Spain, David, from Patricia Lorenzo. She asks, how can we prepare ourselves, and how can the countries around the world prepare in case of a second wave of COVID-19? And that's been a hallmark of all pandemics so far, at least the big ones, right? That there is a second wave. How do we prepare?
Well, it's similar to preparing for the next pandemic. I mean, one of the things that I realized was that even the WHO, they've got a pandemic model. There are always inter-pandemic periods. There's never a non-pandemic period. So we're always between, whether it's waves of the same one. I think it's a very conscious decentralization of response, but it's monitored from above. So we can test a lot of people, but the way stores open up or restaurants, it's going to be different in Milan than it is in Toronto, than it is in Detroit. There are different cultural contexts for these, different ecologies, different interactions with food, different governments who can mandate different sorts of things. You know, China and Vietnam are different than here. So as we look ahead, we want to be more, I use the word nimble. We want to be more adaptable to new situations. And that's as much for the second wave as it is for the next pandemic. So rather than a massive centralized response, it's a centralized facilitation of local responses and monitoring and saying, this seems to be working over here, it's not working over there. Maybe we can share information or shift resources from one place to another, rather than one blanket top-down response, which I don't think is going to work. I mean, everybody locked down, not going to work nationally, but it might work at a community level where people recognize, okay, we know these politicians, we know these public health leaders, we're going to respond to what they're saying. We know the local hospital, how much it's overloaded. So it's that kind of nimbleness, adaptability to new situations. That can only happen if we pull back from the large scale, even medical systems, to more smaller scale, which are more costly, I agree, but they enable us to adapt more quickly to new situations.
David, I have a question that often comes up these days, the anti-vaxxer community. And they've, you know, there's been anti-COVID marches in front of hospitals. They want their rights. They don't want to be vaccinated in the future. What do you make of what's happening there, and what do we do about the anti-vaxxers?
Well, it's complicated. It's one of these Facebook relationships that says it's complicated. I mean, when you say things like measles, I think, well, in the last year, 6,500 people in Democratic Republic of Congo died of measles. Died of measles, not got it, but died. That's, to me, the response of vaccination is, you know, I look at it as a veterinarian, is I'm not trying to protect myself, I'm trying to protect other people, right? So it's, I get the flu vaccine, I might still get it, I might get a mild case, but it's more that I'm trying to break the cycle of transmission. If it's only sold as, this is going to prevent you from getting sick, and then you get some reaction to the vaccine, then you say, well, I got sick anyway. If you turn it around and say, I did my duty for the community, and if we said that when people got vaccinated, they were public health heroes, right? It's not to sort of flip it around and say, instead of saying, if you don't get vaccinated, you're a miserable SOB, say, if you do get vaccinated, you are to be celebrated. You're contributing to breaking the transmission in the community. You're helping our children be healthier. And yes, there may be some personal things involved, and I won't get into that. But I think we need to turn that discussion around. There are people in there who are, you know, the conspiracy theorists and so on. It's 5G or it's whatever. But I think there are some people in there who are legitimately concerned about the effectiveness of vaccines, and maybe they're going to get sick or they get a reaction. And I would ask them reasonably, you know, can you do this for the sake of the community? there's going to be a group of people we're not going to get through to. But we can set rules, say, if you're not vaccinated, you don't go to our schools, because we're trying to protect the other children. Your children, we can build a wall around them, and, there are all kinds of other welfare questions there, but that's a different set of questions.
Okay, thank you, David. And on the note of vaccines, Anna is asking if you've heard, do you have any knowledge of what's being done to develop a vaccine?
That's the one area where we've been very good. That's the part of the science, and we've seen this previously, that we're the best at, the lab science, the identification of things, the structure of the virus, immune responses, and there's a competition, it's like a space race now. And I think there will be a vaccine, and it will be developed in different parts of the world, and who knows how effective it will be. And so there are two issues. Can we develop a vaccine? And the other is, because the way we've developed our science, we're really good at looking at things, stuff, structure of the virus, the animals, the people. We're really bad at looking at relationships, relationships between people and animals, people in the environment, our microbiomes within ourselves and with other people. So sometimes we develop a vaccine which looks like it works really well in the lab, but you put it out into the field and it doesn't work nearly as well because there are differences in diet and exposure, in all kinds of things, genetic background. And so I think there will probably be a vaccine. How good will it be? That's an open question.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to be at this for a long time, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's for a long time.
Okay, a couple more questions, David, before we go. Dorothy is asking, is the WHO initiative to restrict or eliminate wet markets a solution, given sociocultural history of wet markets in developing countries? You touched on that earlier, but specifically, should they be eliminated, the ones that we're talking about?
I think they need to be regulated better. I mean, to be honest, we have fresh markets in North America, but there are food safety inspectors that go through, and we kind of trust that they're going to do that, right? Regulating the wet markets, regulating wildlife trade, regulating certain kinds of consumption, that's a hard sell. I think if anybody can pull it off, it'll be the Chinese government. I mean, they can pull off stuff that nobody else can because they just say, you do this or not, right? So I think the first step is simply, rather than banish them, because that banishes a whole set of livelihoods around there. There are people who are selling in the markets. It'd be like cutting off people who sell in the farmers markets here, saying, well, there's going to be no more farmers markets. Everybody has to go to the commercial grocery stores. But, that solves some problems, but it creates other ones. And I think it would be better to regulate it, to say, if we're going to have these kinds of markets, the animals need to be kept separate from where the other fresh produce is. We're not going to allow wildlife in there. We eat wildlife here. I mean, people go duck hunting, they go deer hunting. I've got friends in New Brunswick who say that you can't make a proper tortilla without the family going out hunting the day before, and you bring back the venison and so on. So we have traditions like that, but they're more regulated. They're not as intense because we don't have billions of people around. So I think a stronger regulation, a building up of trust around people, and then maybe eventually phasing out. But we're still going to have, here we have CSAs and local markets and all of those kind of things. And you can say, well, let's modify the idea of fresh, that you can't bring them into the market and kill them there, bring the live animals in. When I've talked to people in Southeast Asia, they say, well, one of the issues is if you kill the animal, bring it in, nobody buys it. We don't have refrigeration. So we can't keep the chicken, we can't keep the beef, we can't keep the pork. We have to throw it out? What do we do? So there's that part of the equation that needs to be dealt with if we're going to do that, to deal with fresh.
Complicated. It's complicated.
It's interesting.
It's interesting. Fascinating, actually. David, okay, this one, and this touches on my intro. Everyone's going to want to be an epidemiologist now. Any advice for budding epidemiologists who have completed their education, but who have MSc, MPH, PhD, etc., but want to be epidemiologists? What do you say? What's your advice?
I mean, have they taken epidemiology courses? I mean, I don't know. People ask, you know, how did I get to do what I do, which is kind of ecology, health. The kind of work that I do didn't exist when I went through veterinary school. So then I went, and then I studied veterinary epidemiology. I studied diseases of dairy calves, and then expanded from there, and then went to Southeast Asia and looked at other animals. And the situation changed, and by the time I came back and was teaching in the veterinary school, people were less concerned about animal diseases in North America and more concerned about human diseases from farms. So I did epidemiology of foodborne diseases. The underlying skills of looking at populations and interactions, those are useful anywhere. The question is, are there internships? In the States, the Centers for Disease Control has, I can't remember what they call it, but they have positions that you can apply for that you basically work for almost nothing and go to dangerous places in Africa or somewhere else to work on these viruses. And a lot of epidemiologists have trained in these training programs, applied training programs. Various universities have, well, they've got MPHs and so on, and some of them have training programs within that. You know, some of it, if you have the basic knowledge of epidemiology, you can bluff your way into a job, and then you do what the job calls for. I mean, what I did was I said, okay, I'm here to teach epidemiology. I can do that, and I teach all of my courses. But then I also do this other thing with people. You know, I work internationally, and I working on ecology kinds of things. I work with geographers, and so you kind of create new spaces. And I think looking ahead, it's pretty hard to say, here's a job, because we don't know what the jobs are going to be. But you can say, here's a set of skills, and if you can adapt your skills to a new situation, and it might be for a private company who are looking to develop vaccines, it might be for government agencies, it might be for NGOs, you know, Médecins Sans Frontières or Veterinarians Without Borders or something like that, other agencies who are working internationally, and kind of build out from that.
Yeah. Well, great advice. Yes. Just be passionate about what you want to do.
Yes.
Let's take one more question from Paul. Paul asks, what would you recommend we do to improve our testing and follow-up procedures? I don't know if that's something you can speak to, David. What do you think about that?
Well, I think we had a pretty fast response in terms of testing on this. One of the issues has been that the technology didn't quite develop as fast as Facebook and Twitter developed. You know, those things moved much more quickly. But the tech, you know, identifying the virus and identifying, you know, how to test for it, that's happened more quickly. The thing about tracebacks is there are all these concerns about, you know, if you have people follow your cell phone or they put a chip in you or whatever. There are all kinds of downsides to that. It's going to be a mixture. If you early in a pandemic or an epidemic, and you can identify who the key people are, like we were with SARS, you could say, these people were on the airplane with this woman who flew in from Shanghai. So we'll test all of those people, and then who were they in contact with? With this, because the presentation was so variable, it was hard to identify who were they in contact with. It wasn't like the super shedder in the elevator in Hong Kong with SARS, right? We don't have a single person like that. So eventually, probably testing very widely, and I think that's being done. It should have been done earlier, but we didn't have the tests earlier, right? And even the tests that we've got, you know, I've had one of them done. They push the swab right back into your brain, it feels like, you know, you're like, okay. You know, they'll get better at it. And once it gets easier to do those tests, and then they'll be able to go back and do what we call antibody tests, serology tests, where they take blood and they say who has been exposed, and then they can say, does that exposure protect them? And that tells you something about, is the vaccine going to work, or what kind of a vaccine might work? I think we're moving in that direction. We're kind of muddling through this, and I get it. That's where we live, right?
Okay. David, we're quickly running out of time. Here's an easy, quick one. Should we be mandated to wear masks, asks Lori. Should we be mandated to wear masks?
At this point, yes. I think, well, it's, the thing about masks is their importance tends to be local. If you're in a crowded situation, the reason you wear a mask is not to protect yourself, but to protect other people, right? I mean, I wear it partly to protect myself because I'm in that vulnerable age group. But it's so mandated, I'm not sure nationally, but I think community by community, they could say, in this community, it looks like we've got a lot more cases in the hospital. You go to the grocery store, you want to protect those workers. So for sure, we've got one person in our family who goes to the grocery store, happens to be my wife. I used to do the shopping, really. It's not a gender thing, but once we started, she always wears a mask in the grocery store. It's partly to protect the grocery store workers, right? And partly to protect herself. So a situation like that, for sure. Crowded situation, if you're at a protest, yes, absolutely. You got to wear a mask. To drag people out of the protest for not wearing a mask, let them protest. Good, that's great. We need more of that, but wear a mask to protect the people around you.
Okay.
So I wouldn't see it as a national program, but I would see it as a locally responsive program.
Okay. David, on that note, I want to thank you so much for a great conversation. There's been so many questions that we've had to leave some on the table here, but people are engaged and they're interested. Here is the book. You probably have seen it all. Go get it from your local bookstores. It is a real page turner, and it was a real pleasure to read it and to talk to you. So thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Lucy. Great talking to you.
Great.
We'll see you again.
See you again. Bye.
Bye.